My guest joining us now is Dr. Phillip Sinaikin. I believe I'm pronouncing it correct. If not, he'll tell us what it is. He is a practicing clinical psychiatrist, board-certified in psychiatry and addictive psychiatry. He's worked in numerous mental health settings for nearly 30 years, earned his master's degree in humanistic psychology from West Georgia College, and then a medical degree from Boston University. He is the author of 4 books and numerous journal articles on topics ranging from postmodern philosophy to eating disorders. He's a member of the Association for the Advancement of Philosophy and Psychiatry and Society of Existential and Philosophy. His most recent book is Psychiatryland. How to protect yourself from pill-pushing psychiatrists and develop a personal plan for optimal mental health. Nice to have you with us today.
Thank you. It's Sinaikin. That's how you pronounce it. Tough name.
Thank you. I'd like to begin first with what you would consider challengeable within psychiatry and psychology, for that matter. Are these objective sciences, and how prevalent is this, what I would personally consider is the psychiatric community's obsession that whatever they're coming up with in the way of a diagnosis and a treatment must be real and scientific, or otherwise it wouldn't have been accepted and approved and paid for by insurance companies. Please take us through this to determine, from your perspective, what you consider the pure science or possibly the myths.
Well, I would start by answering very definitively that psychiatry is not a science. It lacks the core fundamental property of a science, which is that the hypotheses in that science are potentially able to be disproven. And I'll give you a very simple example that I use in my book, which is a child who's acting up in school is taken to a psychologist, and the psychologist says, your child has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and needs to be on medication to control her behavior. You decide, I'm not happy with just one opinion, I'm going to go to another professional. You go to a board-certified child psychiatrist who tells you, well, I know that the previous doctor diagnosed attention deficit disorder, but we're learning that many children who present with these symptoms are really bipolar, and they suffer from bipolar disorder, which has very serious consequences, and treatment should be begun immediately, and there is going to be a lot of long-term problems if you don't treat her. And then you go to a systems-oriented psychologist who tells you, no, this is not ADHD and this is not bipolar disorder. This is family dysfunction. It needs to be treated with family therapy. So there you have what are basically 3 hypotheses. Sounds very scientific. What's lacking is the ability to disprove any of them as true. You would, I think, very rightfully go to the doctor and say, well, I've gotten 3 different opinions about what's wrong with my child. Now, before I do something and actually put chemicals into her body or initiate some treatment plan, I would like some proof that she has this illness. And they'll say, well, we don't have any proof. Well, at least can you disprove that she has what the other doctor said? And when you lack that, then you lack the core essence of what is a science. And psychiatry lacks that. It acts as if it has it. You think they have it. They talk about the brain all the time. They talk about chemical imbalances. They throw around PET scans and MRIs. And yet there is absolutely no understanding at this time of any specific causal correlation between the action of neurons in the brain and the expression of emotional and behavioral problems. That's just the hardcore truth.
Then why is it that you are one of only a handful of psychiatrists, board certified, with an academic background, willing to discuss this? Why aren't the other, 40,000 psychiatrists willing to acknowledge this and go forward by adjusting the therapeutic model?
Well, it would be very hard to adjust the model, but it's more than that. It really encompasses all aspects of existence, including, very importantly, the economic aspect. I mean, I know psychiatrists personally, although I'm getting older now and there's fewer of us around, who might have been staunch psychoanalysts at one time who now do nothing but prescribe medication. And like Willie Sutton, because that's where the money is. And I hate to be so shallow, but that is a harsh and true reality of our existence in this culture, that you have to make a living. And when insurance companies dictate the fact that we will only pay for a 15-minute medication check after your initial 1-hour evaluation, then that's the service you provide, or you don't have anything reimbursable to do. But it's also more than that. It really has a lot to do with what is sometimes called the social construction of truth. See, I really am more a philosopher than a practitioner in my thinking. In my actions, I'm a practitioner. But, you know, I have spent my lifetime wondering about truth and reality and exploring that in the philosophical literature. And there's an entire dimension of philosophers that talk about the social construction of truth. So what we're really dealing with here is doctors who truly believe at the level of objective reality that psychiatry has progressed into a modern medical science. They're not being hypocrites. They're just pulled along with the tide of the social construction of truth. The reason I named my book Psychiatryland was to draw attention to another phenomena where we all witness the social construction of truth, which is Disneyland. Probably the most skilled example of the social construction of a lived reality in our culture. That Disneyland is a magical kingdom, the happiest place on earth where wishes and dreams come true. And we actually experience it that way, although in reality it's just an amusement park that's kind of crowded and hot and busy and tiring if you go there. But, you know, we live it at that different level. So, you know, it's gotten to the point now where we all kind of share in this socially constructed truth that psychiatry is a scientific enterprise that works with objective truth because it uses the language of it. It uses the mechanics of science. It just is not a science. Nor is science the answer to all of humans' problems and questions. See, that's the other shared reality we have, that ultimately all answers will come from science. But, of course, that's not true. Science is just one way of looking at things. I hope this isn't too confusing.
To the contrary, it's extremely clarifying, and I thank you for getting rid of the medical turbidity in the language that most couch it to protect their own interest.
Yes.
But by extension, then, if you would please, let's take this to the next level, and that is, if psychiatry is not a science, but we are told it is, and if they are now heavily promoting teen screen, and I believe it started with George Bush when he was governor, but then morphed into something now that has a whole national ALEC-based, and ALEC, of course, is the lobbying group of special corporate interests.
I think George called it the Freedom Council or something along those lines.
And now you have children asked to take a simple questionnaire, and we have actual examples of children, teenagers, who've taken the questionnaire, and one was actually taken to a mental institution against their the parents' will, and forcibly medicated and given electroconvulsive therapy, and was there for over 6 months. Why? Because of two questions and how it was interpreted. They said she had obsessive-compulsive disorder because she liked to keep her room clean, and shyness disorder because she didn't like going to dances. She didn't like big crowded areas. Well, if we are able to agree as a society that only governmental scientists, and by extension then government mandate, that if you must take a mental competency test, everyone is supposed to. If you fail it or you don't get the answers that show you're normal, then you have no choice but to go under their medication regime. What does that mean? And how realistic is that to helping anybody except those people who are part of that profit center? Your thoughts, please.
Well, you have to define what you call help. It's amazing to me that when information is disseminated in this culture, that it runs counter to the socially constructed truths, even when it's made available, it doesn't get utilized. For example, there has been a lot of information recently on major outlets such as the NBC Nightly News and in major newspapers that there's serious doubts about whether antidepressants have any benefit beyond placebo in mild to moderate depression. So you would think that would penetrate somewhere into the brains of those people that are out in the world, and that the users of antidepressant medications might question their ongoing use, and also the providers might say, gee, well, maybe it's not so simple that, primary care doctor might say, maybe it's not so simple that every time a person walks into my office and starts crying, that I hand them a prescription for Zoloft, and that's the answer to the problem, and that's the proper thing to do. And yet that doesn't happen, because now we're dealing with power. We're not dealing with just belief. We're now dealing with the impact on belief of power, or as Foucault, one of the philosophers that I really appreciate, has said, that power runs knowledge. So now we're talking about the same things I was listening to when I was on hold, the government in bed with the pharmaceutical industry, because what this all boils down to in the end is creating a customer base. I hate to say it. This sounds so shallow and dystopian, but these screening tests are to maintain a customer base, or to actually create a customer base. And as my friend Martha Rosenberg points out, we're doing it now with children so that we can have customers for life. So it's frightening, and now we're getting to the point where it might require some sort of social rebellion against instruments like Teen Screen before that can be changed.
There's one more
challenges
point.
In court, etc. Those kind of things.
Unfortunately, that doesn't always work, because the judge is frequently limited in his own court or her court by acknowledging that the sole legal arbiter is the psychiatrist or the person from the mental institution, and which means anyone else trying to prove that they are not insane or don't need this care has an enormous obstacle to overcome.
But there are people arguing the other side. I mean, if I was the only person that saw this, I would think that I was, certifiable and should be put away. But there's thousands of brilliant minds in this world that see this, that argue it. There's many books. There's many authors. These organizations you mentioned, like the Association for the Advancement of Philosophy and Psychiatry, another one called the ISEPP, are organizations of people committed to fighting this direction that psychiatry is going. And, it isn't a singular voice, and you can mount arguments in court, as a group called Mind Freedom has done, but you got to be careful about your arguments. I mean, it can't always be like our politics in this country, extreme left versus extreme right. You can't argue against you just can't go in there and argue that there's no such thing as mental illness, and the other side is arguing that mental illness is a true physical disease, and then you just clash and nothing is accomplished. I have to say, and I'm not trying to promote the book, but in Psychiatryland I try to find that middle ground where you actually can utilize the good that's going on in biological psychiatry. It's not all useless or some sort of plot against people. It's an effort to help people, but it's gone way overboard, and that needs to be pulled back in, as do the people who argue there's no such thing as mental illness, because I would argue that's a pretty difficult position to sustain as well, when we see such clear-cut and undeniable examples of the abnormality of human behavior around us. But, you need to bring it to something into it called wisdom.
I agree.
Okay.
Let me give you a little example of this. I befriended, at the beginning of my career, individuals who just happened to be either psychoanalysts or psychiatrists. Alan Perlmutter, also Carmi Harari, let me see who else back then. There were a couple who were well known and were actually authors. And they were more humanistic. In fact, all of them were humanistic. Elaine Kahn, very humanistic. Now, either a psychiatrist or a psychologist, Alan Cott, for example, these individuals spent quality time sitting with a person trying to determine why they might be able to be, why they are reacting and why they're acting out in some way. And I must say that in a lot of the people who I knew who were seeing them, there was some measurable improvement. Today, it is rare for someone, a psychiatrist, to spend quality time sitting with someone and to try to find out what might be going on in the person's life. For example, we had someone whose kids had absolutely been diagnosed by 3 separate psychiatrists as suffering from ADD and ADHD in one of the cases. But when nothing was working and one of the kids was suicidal and one was not able to eat, and I saw them and I counseled them, did some simple tests and determined that they were both extremely hyper on caffeine, and no one had asked how much caffeine. One was taking 700 milligrams caffeine a day, the other over 600 milligrams. I'd like to see anyone pay attention and sit still when you're on 700 milligrams caffeine. Plus, they both stayed up late at night. They didn't get adequate sleep. They were having junk food meals. And the mother said after they eat their sugar, they're bouncing off the walls. Did the doctor talk about their diet? Not at all. So once they got their diet cleaned up, and once they had their nutritional biochemistry rebalanced, guess what? They no longer had the symptoms that were manifesting as this, and yet this isn't even considered in the paradigms. So talk about for a moment, at least from your personal perspective and experience, those individuals who at one time were guiding people in the light of more humanistic and philosophically based ways of helping people who are having emotional problems, and today where it's more often than not a pharmaceutical approach.
Well, I mean, I just think there's a lot of factors at work, but I can actually point to something that people are probably not very aware of, and that's the training of our practitioners. That we no longer pursue the idea of the psychiatrist being more widely knowledgeable about philosophy, sociology, and even psychology. They don't even, they're not even required anymore to learn the theories of psychology, which is what broadens your horizons and opens your mind up to other ways of thinking, alternative explanations of what you're seeing in front of you, including nutritional, but it can also be familial. And, let's just add things like there's a book called Ritalin Nation that argues that this epidemic of attention deficit disorder is really an epidemic of stimulation disorder, that there's just too much stimulation going on. And you put one of these kids that is used to, the iPhone in one ear and the iPad in the hands and the television going on in the background and texting someone all at the same time, and put them in a quiet classroom, and they're going to be bouncing off the walls, that they're stimulus deprived. So, it's all a matter of creating practitioners who have a wide range of knowledge and a wide range of possibilities in their mind. And the narrowing down of this to these few diagnostic possibilities, including whatever they're going to come up with in DSM-5, is the limiting factor from the get-go. So you have these dilemmas that are created that, the first thing that people are given is a diagnosis. And the diagnosis, everything flows from that: prognosis, treatment, expectations. And, the other more subtle things are that once you're diagnosed with something, the other people around you change their behavior towards you. It's kind of like in physics, they say that if you observe something, it changes the behavior of it. Well, if you now believe that your spouse is bipolar because some doctor told you that after a 5-minute questionnaire, well, now your entire conceptualization of why your spouse acts the way that they do has changed. Your expectations have changed. Their world has changed right around them. I say in my book that it doesn't even matter if there's anything wrong with your brain anymore, that once you're diagnosed bipolar, at some level you become bipolar. You take up that script. So I think that, we need to be thinking about the education of our practitioners, but, I just don't know where you approach that. All the money for education comes from NIH, and it comes from the pharmaceutical companies. And although there's some undermining now of the pharmaceutical companies directly funding things, there's just all these back doors, just like in our politics, that their influence will be felt. and will be manifested in all of the research in psychiatry. And there's, I'm not sure what you do about it. This isn't about my job. I think is to, really display the problem in all of its aspects, and then hopefully people can take up solutions. I do offer the solution that already exists in our culture. You don't have to go to a doctor if you're depressed. You can go other places. You can go to counselors first. All of us run to our doctors. And our doctors are going to act in very predictable ways. They're going to diagnose and treat. And how do you, as a primary care physician, see 50 patients a day? Well, you can only give each patient 10 minutes. So along with checking their blood pressure and their blood sugar, you're going to treat their emotional disturbance by writing a prescription. So it really is about consumers becoming more savvy. And I don't know how you do that for sure. Spread the word.
Yes, it is. And this kind of interview helps a lot of people.
I hope so, yeah.
My last question, and if you could summarize this rather briefly, with many things we do in our lives that don't work out, we look at the consequences. We're now seeing a very high adverse reaction in psychiatric drugs. And you also have to look at, I went back 30 years, the number one cause of death in 10 to 14-year-old boys is suicide. Yep. We never had that in the top 20 causes of death in the past. Do you see this as because so many young people, young boys in particular, are being diagnosed and treated with these drugs, and suicidal ideation and akathisia and other conditions are a side effect?
Well, I do see us putting medications into people's system that our understanding is they act in the central nervous system, affecting neuronal activity. And beyond that, we don't know anything for sure. All we know is we're mucking with people's brains. And I think that should be reserved for the most dire cases. And instead, it's being used widely without any concern of consequences. It's terrifying. Let me tell you, we just got a warning a couple months ago about an antidepressant drug that's been used for 20 years that it can cause heart attacks. It took 20 years for that warning to emerge. We got a warning about early 2000s about, or maybe about 2004, 2005, about a drug called Paxil that is associated with birth defects. It was approved in 1992. This whole business of tardive dyskinesia, akathisia, dementia from antipsychotic medications is well known from the early generation of antipsychotics. But then the pharmaceutical companies come up with these so-called second generation or atypical antipsychotics, and it's as if everybody forgets. Dan Rather was on Bill Maher last week, and Dan Rather said the most frightening thing about our country is its amnesia. We learned these lessons the first go-round with these drugs. So, the drug companies come out with these revolutionary products that are going to revolutionize, and we just forget what happened the first time around. That in the long run, we saw a lot of evidence of damage. This is, of course, Robert Whitaker's argument in Anatomy of an Epidemic, and one in which he's been getting a lot of grief trying to prove that. I mean, you go out there with these kind of points of view, and you're going to run into a lot of massive backlash.
We're aware of that, and that's all the more reason. Trust me, we're aware of that. But we really respect the fact that you've had the courage to stand up and hold a mirror to your own profession and say, let's take an honest look at what we have become.
Well, beyond that, I try to say, what can we do about it? And it hasn't received any attention. Couldn't even, and I'm not gonna cry over spilt milk, but I couldn't even find a publisher. I had to self-publish this book. It's just not on people's minds, It's just. I think it's gotten to the point that so much has been explored in terms of the negative side of market-based capitalism that people are exhausted with it. They just don't want to hear it anymore.
Well, this is really not about body politics. This is about our own personal sanctity.
Yeah. It's
and
more
knowing
important
that if we have an emotional problem, if we have a mental problem, we should be able to trust that there will be individuals there who will look after us and try to help us without simply looking at what is in their own best interest or what they're indoctrinated to. And you've laid out a very compelling argument in Psychiatryland. And the website is psychiatryland.com.
Yeah.
I thank you very much for your good work. We look, hopefully, the people in this audience who respond very favorably to important topics and guests as articulate as you, who put it out on the line. And that's what we want.
I appreciate it. And if they want the book, it's on Amazon. Okay? And thank you for having me. I really do appreciate it.
All the best to you.
Thank you.
And that was Dr. Phillip Sinaikin, Sinaikin.